it, she's an old woman! This is for all the years—
Fen the maid begged her to stop, but the Mafia boss's fiancé slapped his mother, and regretted it. What I'm about to tell you is a story about a single moment that destroyed everything. 3 seconds. A lifetime of consequences. If you've ever said something in anger you couldn't take back. If you've ever watched your entire future crumble because of one terrible decision. If you've ever wondered whether redemption is real, or just something we tell ourselves to feel better, then stay with me until the very end of this story. And if you believe that people can change, that our worst moments don't have to be our final moments, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you think you know about forgiveness, growth and second chances. Salse. The sound was like a thunderclap in the elegant sitting room. Isabella Chen's hand connected with Sophia Romano's face with such force that the older woman stumbled backward, her reading glasses flying off and clattering across the marble floor. For exactly 3 heartbeats, the entire world seemed to freeze. The grandfather clock in the corner stopped mid-tick. The birds outside the tall windows went silent. Even the dust particles suspended in the afternoon sunlight seemed to pause in their lazy drift downward. Isabella stood there with her hands still raised, her chest heaving, her vision swimming with tears of rage and humiliation. Across from her, Sophia Romano pressed one trembling hand to her reddening cheek, her eyes wide with shock that was already transforming into something else, something that looked almost like pity. And between them, Rosa Martinez, the Romano family's housekeeper for 28 years, let out a sound that was part gasp, part sound, part prayer in Spanish that translated roughly to, "Oh God! What have you done?" Rosa had tried to stop it. Sweet Jesus, she had tried. Her calloused hands had reached out, grasping at Isabella's designer sleeve, her voice urgent and breaking as she pleaded in a mixture of English and Spanish. "Miss Isabella, por favor, please don't do this. You don't understand. Please, I'm begging you, stop and think. Mrs. Sophia, she only wants to help. Please, please. You must calm yourself." But Isabella had shaken her off with a fury that seemed to come from somewhere deep and primal. Some wounded place inside her that had finally exploded outward. Now, in the awful silence that followed, Isabella felt reality crash over her like a bucket of ice water. She saw Sophia's face clearly for the first time since their argument had begun. Saw the lines etched by years of grief and survival, saw the strength it must have taken to raise a son alone, after watching his father die. Saw the genuine concern that had motivated every word Isabella had interpreted as an attack. She saw Rosa's face, twisted with anguish that went beyond this single moment, as if the housekeeper were watching a tragedy she had witnessed before. A pattern repeating itself despite her desperate efforts to prevent it. And most devastating of all, she heard footsteps approaching rapidly from somewhere in the mansion, the distinctive stride of Marco Romano, coming to investigate the commotion. Isabella had met Marco Romano 6 months earlier at an art gallery opening in Manhattan. She had been there as a favor to her best friend who was showcasing her paintings, nursing a glass of expensive wine she didn't really enjoy, counting the minutes until she could politely leave. Her life had been in a transitional phase, as her therapist liked to call it. She had just left her job at a prestigious but soul-crushing corporate law firm. Her engagement to her college boyfriend had ended badly 3 months prior. And at 31, she was living in her childhood bedroom in her parents' house in Queens, trying to figure out what the hell she was supposed to do with the rest of her life. Marco had approached her while she was standing in front of a particularly aggressive abstract piece, all sharp angles and violent reds. He hadn't used a pickup line or complimented her appearance or done any of the predictables men usually did at these events. Instead, he had stood beside her in silence for a full minute before saying, "It looks like anger. But if you look closely at the lower right corner, there's this tiny bit of gold. Like hope trying to break through." She had turned to look at him then, really look at him. He was handsome in an understated way, with dark hair touched with premature silver, strong features, and eyes that seemed to carry the weight of experiences she could only imagine. But it was that observation, That ability to see both the violence and the hope in the painting. That caught her attention. They had talked for hours that night. Long after the gallery had closed and they had moved to a nearby coffee shop that stayed open until midnight. He told her he ran an import-export business. Which she would later learn was technically true, but left out significant details about what exactly was being imported and exported. She told him about her crisis of purpose. About feeling like she had followed all the rules and checked all the boxes, only to discover the life she had built didn't actually make her happy. He had listened without trying to fix her or offer platitudes. He had shared his own struggles with living up to family expectations. With trying to honor his father's legacy, while also trying to be his own person. There was a loneliness in him that matched her own. A sense of being surrounded by people but still fundamentally alone. Their courtship had been intense. Marco pursued her with a focus that was flattering and slightly overwhelming. He sent thoughtful gifts. Not expensive jewelry but books he thought she would enjoy based on their conversations. Tickets to small theater productions. Handwritten notes that made her laugh. He introduced her to his world gradually, elegant dinners at exclusive restaurants. Weekends at his family's estate in Westchester. Meetings with his business associates that Isabella understood were being conducted in a language of looks and subtle gestures she couldn't quite decode. She had fallen for him quickly, swept up in the romance and the feeling of being seen and valued in a way she hadn't experienced in her previous relationship. When he proposed to her after 4 months, on a rooftop overlooking the city with candles and rose petals, and a ring that must have cost more than her yearly salary at the law firm. She had said yes without hesitation. But she had been so caught up in Marco himself, that she hadn't paid enough attention to what came with him. The business that operated in shadows and spoke in codes. The associates with hard eyes and harder reputations. The mother who had looked at Isabella, with something Isabella had interpreted as disapproval, from their very first meeting. Sofia Romano had been polite during Isabella's initial visits to the family estate. She had served tea and asked appropriate questions about Isabella's background and education. But there had been a distance there. A reservation that Isabella had found insulting. She was accomplished, educated, from a respectable family. What more could this woman want? Isabella had tried harder to win Sofia over, been warmer and more open during family dinners, asked questions about family history and traditions, offered to help with wedding planning. But the more Isabella tried, the more Sofia seemed to withdraw, as if Isabella's efforts only confirmed some private suspicion. The tension had finally erupted today. Sofia had called Isabella and asked her to come to the estate for what she said would be an important conversation. Isabella had arrived feeling optimistic. Hoping this would finally be the breakthrough moment when Sofia welcomed her fully into the family. Instead, Sofia had dropped a bomb. They had been sitting in the bright, airy sitting room. Afternoon sunlight streaming through the tall windows. Expensive China tea service laid out between them. Rosa had been in and out, bringing fresh pastries, refilling tea, her presence quiet but constant, and then Sofia had begun to speak. Isabella. I've asked you here today because I need to be direct with you about something I can no longer keep silent about. I don't believe you should marry my son. The words had hit Isabella like a physical blow. She had set down her teacup carefully, her hands suddenly shaking. I'm sorry, what did you say? You heard me correctly. Sofia's voice was gentle but firm, her posture straight and dignified. This is not about you being a bad person or even unsuitable in the abstract. Under different circumstances, I would be delighted to welcome someone like you into our family. But these are not different circumstances. These are the circumstances we have. And in these circumstances, this marriage would be a mistake that would hurt both you and my son. Isabella had felt heat rising in her face, her heart beginning to pound. I don't understand. Marco and I love each other. We're both adults. Why would you possibly think you have any say in whether we get married? Sofia had sighed, a sound weighted with years of experience and hard-won wisdom. You're right that you don't need my permission. But you should want my understanding, my insighting what this life actually entails. And I'm telling you, With all the kindness I can muster, that you don't understand what you're choosing. I'm not some knave child. Isabella had protested, her voice rising. I know your family business isn't entirely conventional. Marco and I have discussed this. I understand there are risks. Understanding there are risks and truly comprehending what those risks mean are entirely different things. Sophia had said, leaning forward slightly. My dear girl, you cannot imagine what it's like to live every day wondering if this will be the day your husband doesn't come home. You cannot imagine the moral compromises you'll make without even realizing you're making them. The way you'll train yourself not to ask questions. Not to see things that are right in front of you. Rosa, arranging flowers in a vase near the window, had made a small sound of agreement or perhaps remembrance. Sophia had glanced at her before continuing. I was 25 when I married Marco's father Antonio. I thought I was so worldly, so prepared for anything. I had grown up in a similar world, I thought I understood the rules. But nothing could have prepared me for the reality of it. Isabella had wanted to interrupt, to defend herself, but something in Sophia's voice had made her pause despite her anger. I wasn't prepared for the first time Antonio came home with blood on his shirt and told me we would never speak of it. I wasn't prepared for the funerals of men I had laughed with at dinner parties, knowing that my husband might have ordered their deaths. I wasn't prepared for the isolation, for the constant vigilance, for teaching my son to always check under the car before getting in, to never establish predictable routines, to trust no one completely. Sophia's hands had tightened in her lap, the only sign of emotion in her otherwise controlled demeanor. And I certainly wasn't prepared for the day I watched my husband bleed to death on the sidewalk at our favorite restaurant, while I screamed for help that came too late. I wasn't prepared to explain to my 8-year-old son why his father was never coming home. I wasn't prepared to spend the next 23 years raising that boy alone, every day afraid that the same fate would find him. The room had felt heavy with these revelations. Isabella had found herself momentarily speechless, caught between her defensive anger and a growing sense of unease about whether she had truly considered what marrying Marco meant. I tell you this, Sophia had continued softly, not to be cruel or to hurt you, but because no one told me these things before I made my choice. No one sat me down and explained in concrete terms what I was signing up for. I had to learn through painful experience. I'm trying to spare you that same pain. That was when Isabella's defenses had fully activated, when all her old wounds about not being good enough had come rushing back. She had grown up as the youngest of 3 daughters in an ambitious immigrant family. Her older sisters had been perfect, achieving everything their parents wanted. Isabella had always been the difficult one, the one who questioned things, who didn't quite fit the mold. She had spent her entire life trying to prove she was just as capable, just as worthy, just as deserving of success and happiness. Hearing Sophia suggest she wasn't suitable for Marco had hit every one of those old bruises. So what you're really saying, Isabella had said, her voice tight with barely controlled anger, is that you don't think I'm strong enough, smart enough, good enough for your precious son. That's not what I'm saying at all, Sophia had replied calmly. I'm saying that this life requires a specific kind of strength that you haven't had to develop. Not because you're weak, but because you've been fortunate enough not to need it. And I'm saying that acquiring that strength comes at a cost I don't wish on anyone, especially not someone I can see still has light in her eyes, still has possibilities open to her. How dare you, Isabella had hissed, standing up abruptly from her chair. How dare you sit there and make judgments about what I can and cannot handle? You don't know me. You don't know what I'm capable of. Rosa had moved forward then, her weathered hands reaching out imploringly. Miss Isabella, please. Mrs. Sophia, she speaks from love, from experience. Please, you must listen to her wisdom. Please, calm yourself and think about what she's trying to tell you. But Isabella had been too far gone, too consumed by the fire of her own hurt pride and accumulated resentments. This is between Sophia and me, Rosa. I don't need you to interfere. The dismissiveness in her tone, the way she reduced Rosa to just the help, had made the housekeeper flinch visibly. But Rosa had persisted. Her voice more urgent now. Miss Isabella, poor favor, I have seen this before. I have watched what happens when people enter this life without understanding. Please, I am begging you, don't let your anger make you do something you cannot undo. What I'm going to do, Isabella had said, moving closer to Sophia. Her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Is marry the man I love despite his controlling, manipulative mother who can't stand to see him happy with someone else. Sophia had stood as well, meeting Isabella's anger with a calm that only made Isabella angrier. I want nothing more than for my son to be happy. But I've learned that happiness built on illusions doesn't last. Better a difficult truth, now than a devastating revelation later when you're trapped by marriage and possibly children. You're trying to sabotage our relationship because you're bitter about your own life. Isabella had accused, her voice shaking. You're projecting your trauma onto us, trying to prevent Marco from having what you couldn't have. My trauma, as you call it, has given me perspective you don't yet have, Sophia had said, her voice still maddeningly calm. And from that perspective, I can see that you're not ready for this life. Perhaps you'll never be ready for it, and that's not a criticism. Most people shouldn't be ready for this life. It's not a life anyone should have to live. Rosa had physically stepped between them then, her small frame somehow commanding despite her age. Please. Both of you, please stop this. Miss Isabella, you don't understand what you're about to do. Mrs. Sophia is trying to protect you. Please just take a breath. Step back, think about. But Isabella had pushed past Rosa, driven by a rage she couldn't control anymore. Fueled by every time she had been told she wasn't enough. Every time she had been made to feel less than. Every rejection and criticism and doubt. She had stood directly in front of Sophia, invading her personal space, her voice raw with pain disguised as anger. You want to protect me? Then stay out of my life and let me make my own choices. Stop pretending this is about concern when it's really about control. Stop trying to run Marco's life because you're terrified of being alone. And that was when Sophia had said the words that shattered Isabella's last bit of restraint. Her voice still calm, still measured, but with an edge of steel. I would rather be alone than watch my son marry someone who will destroy him with her naivety and pride. I would rather lose his affection for telling the truth, than keep it by staying silent. While he makes the biggest mistake of his life. The slap had come from somewhere beyond Isabella's conscious control. Her hand had moved before her brain registered the decision, propelled by hurt so deep it felt like it might consume her entirely. The sharp crack of contact, Sophia's sharp stumble, Rosa's anguished cry, the glasses flying off and breaking, and then Marco's voice from the doorway, cold and quiet and devastating. What the hell is going on here? Isabella had turned to see him standing there, taking in the scene. His mother holding her cheek, Rosa crying openly, Isabella herself in a posture of violence she didn't recognize as her own. And she watched his face change, watched confusion become understanding, become something that looked like grief. Isabella, leave. His voice was flat, emotionless, which somehow felt worse than if he had yelled. Leave this house now. Marco, please, let me explain. Your mother was, I said leave. Still quiet. Still controlled, but with an undercurrent of fury that made Isabella's stomach drop. Get out of this house before I have you removed. But you don't understand what she said to me. I understand that you struck my mother. Marco moved into the room but not toward Isabella. Instead, he went to Sophia, gently taking her arm to steady her. Mama, are you alright? Rosa, please get ice and call Dr. Morrison. I'm fine, Marco, Sophia said, her dignity intact despite the red mark blooming on her cheek. I don't need a doctor. You're getting one anyway. Marco's voice was firm. Then he turned to Isabella, and his eyes were those of a stranger. Leave now, Isabella. We'll talk later, if I decide there's anything left to talk about. Isabella had felt panic rising, threatening to choke her. Marco, please. Now. The single word was final, absolute. Isabella had no choice but to leave. She walked through the mansion in a daze, past expensive art and imported furniture, hearing nothing but the sound of her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely get her car keys out of her purse. The drive back to her parents' house passed in a blur. She kept replaying the moment over and over, seeing Sophia's face, hearing Rosa's pleading, feeling the sting of her palm against skin. What had she done? What had she become in that moment of uncontrolled rage? She made it to her childhood bedroom. Before the full weight of it hit her, she had struck an elderly woman. She had committed violence against Marco's mother, again survived more pain and loss than Isabella could imagine. She had ignored Rosa's desperate attempts to stop her, had been cruel to a woman who had shown her nothing but kindness. And she had done it all, because she couldn't handle hearing difficult truths about herself. Isabella collapsed on her bed and cried harder than she had since she was a child. Great, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep in her chest. The kind of crying that leaves you exhausted and hollow. She had ruined everything. She had proven Sophia right in the worst possible way. Had shown herself to be exactly the kind of person who couldn't handle the pressures and provocations and the life she had been so eager to join. The call started within hours. Her mother, who had somehow already heard through the social network that something had happened. Her oldest sister, calling with thinly veiled satisfaction to ask if the engagement was off. Friends wanting details, wanting gossip. Wanting to know what had really happened. Isabella ignored them all. She lay in her darkened room, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of the confrontation. And slowly, as her anger cooled and her pride deflated, she began to really hear what Sophia had been trying to tell her. Sophia hadn't been attacking her. She had been warning her, trying to protect her from a future she wasn't prepared for. Everything she had said about the costs and compromises, about the fear and isolation, about the impossibility of truly preparing for that life, it had all been true. Isabella had just been too defensive, too wounded, too caught up in her own insecurities to hear it. And Rosa, sweet, kind Rosa, who had tried so hard to prevent this disaster. Isabella had treated her with casual cruelty, had dismissed her as irrelevant, as just the help who should stay out of adult conversations. The memory of Rosa's face, the hurt and disappointment there, made Isabella feel sick with shame. 3 days passed with no word from Marco. On the 4th day, a messenger arrived with a package. Inside was the engagement ring Isabella had been wearing, returned without explanation or note. The message was clear. It was over. Isabella held the ring in her palm, this symbol of a future that had crumbled in the space of a single slap. She thought about calling Marco, trying to explain, trying to apologize. But what could she possibly say? How could she justify what she had done? Instead, she did something she hadn't done in years. She got down on her knees and prayed. Not because she was particularly religious, but because she was desperate and lost and needed to reach for something beyond herself. She prayed for forgiveness she didn't deserve. She prayed for the strength to face what she had done. She prayed for some kind of path forward from this nightmare she had created. The answer came 2 weeks later in the form of Rosa appearing at her parents' door. Isabella's mother had called her down from her room, saying there was a visitor. When Isabella saw Rosa standing there with a covered dish and a sad smile, she broke down crying right in the foyer. "Come, Majita," Rosa said gently, taking Isabella's arm and leading her to the living room. "We need to talk." Once they were alone, Rosa handed Isabella the dish. "I made you pozole. You need to eat. You look terrible. Why are you here?" Isabella asked, her voice raw from crying. "After what I did, after how I treated you. Why would you come here?" Rosa settled into the chair across from Isabella with a sigh. "Because I have lived long enough to know that people are more than their worst moments. And because someone needs to help you understand what happened so you can grow from it instead of being destroyed by it." Isabella felt fresh tears starting. "I don't deserve your kindness." "Maybe not," Rosa agreed matter-of-factly. "But I'm not here because you deserve it. I'm here because I've seen too many lives destroyed by pride and anger and the inability to face difficult truths. I'm here to try to break that cycle." Over the next hours, Rosa talked to Isabella with a gentleness that made her shame even more acute. She explained what Sophia had been trying to tell her, giving concrete examples from her 28 years with the Romano family. She described the funerals she had attended, the widows she had comforted, the children who had grown up without fathers. She talked about Sophia's grief after Antonio's death, about the years of fear and vigilance raising Marco alone. "Mrs. Sophia wasn't judging you," Rosa said. "She was trying to spare you the pain she has lived through. She could see that you didn't understand what you were choosing. And she cared enough to try to warn you. Even knowing you might hate her for it. I was so defensive," Isabella said, the realization settling over her like a heavy blanket. "I heard everything she said as an attack because I was too insecure to consider that she might be right." "Yes," Rosa said simply. "But now you know. The question is what you do with this knowledge. How do I fix this?" Isabella asked desperately. "How do I make it right?" Rosa was quiet for a long moment. "Some things cannot be fixed, Majita. Some mistakes are too large, their consequences too far-reaching. But they can be learned from. They can become the foundation for change, if you're willing to do the hard work." The work of understanding yourself. Why did you react with violence? What in your history made you vulnerable to that loss of control? Until you understand those things, until you truly face them, you risk repeating the pattern in different ways. Rosa leaned forward, her eyes serious. "And you must make amends where you can. Not to get Marco back. Not to make yourself feel better. But because it's the right thing to do." Isabella spent the following weeks in deep reflection. She found a therapist and began the painful work of examining her patterns, her wounds, her triggers. She discovered that her reaction to Sophia hadn't really been about Sophia at all. It had been about a lifetime of feeling inadequate. Of competing with perfect sisters, of never quite measuring up to her parents' expectations. Sophia's concerns had hit every one of those old bruises. And Isabella had lashed out like a wounded animal. Understanding this didn't excuse what she had done. But it helped her see the path forward. She needed to heal these old wounds, to develop a sense of self-worth that wasn't dependent on others' approval. To learn how to handle criticism and rejection without becoming destructive. She also began to really consider what kind of life she wanted. Had she truly wanted to marry into the Romano family? Or had she been attracted to Marco, partially because winning him would prove something to her family, to herself, to everyone who had ever doubted her? The honest answer was uncomfortable. She had loved Marco, yes. But she had also loved the idea of him. The status and excitement, and the way being chosen by someone powerful made her feel valuable. She hadn't seriously considered whether she wanted the reality of his life, only whether she could claim the prize of his affection. 2 months after the incident, Isabella wrote a letter to Sophia. It took her 3 weeks to write it, going through dozens of drafts, trying to find words adequate to express her remorse and her understanding. Finally, she settled on simplicity and honesty. "Dear Sophia, I am writing to apologize for striking you, though I know no apology can undo what I did. You were trying to help me. To protect me from making a choice I wasn't prepared for, and I responded with violence, because I couldn't handle hearing difficult truths about myself. I was wrong. You were right about everything. I wasn't ready for the life you were describing, and my reaction to your concerns proved exactly how unprepared I was. I am working with a therapist to understand why I reacted the way I did, and to ensure I never respond to conflict with violence again. I don't expect your forgiveness, and I'm not asking for another chance with Marco. I simply wanted you to know that I understand now what you were trying to tell me. And I'm grateful that you cared enough to try, even knowing I might not receive it well. With deep regret and respect, Isabella." She sent the letter with no expectation of response. So she was shocked when, 3 weeks later, she received a phone call from an unknown number. When she answered, Sophia's voice greeted her. "Isabella, this is Sophia Romano. I received your letter. Would you be willing to meet with me?" They met at a small café far from both the Romano estate and Isabella's neighborhood. Sophia arrived looking elegant but tired, and there was a fading bruise on her cheek that made Isabella feel sick with shame all over again. "Thank you for seeing me," Isabella said as they sat down. "I don't deserve your time after what I did." "Perhaps not," Sophia agreed. But Rosa thinks you've been doing real work on yourself and I trust her judgment. I wanted to see for myself. They talked for 2 hours. Isabella didn't make excuses or try to minimize what she had done. She simply explained what she had learned about herself. About the insecurities and wounds that had made her so reactive, about the work she was doing to change. Sophia listened without interrupting, her face thoughtful. Finally, the older woman spoke. I forgive you, Isabella. Not because what you did was acceptable, but because I can see you've truly faced it, and are working to ensure it never happens again. That takes real courage. Isabella felt tears streaming down her face. I don't know how to thank you for that. Don't thank me. Just continue the work, continue growing. And Isabella. Sophia reached across to take her hand. I want you to know that I meant what I said that day. You are a good person. You were just not prepared for the life Marco leads. That's not a failing on your part, it's simply a reality. I understand that now, Isabella said. I think I was in love with the idea of being with someone like Marco more than I was truly prepared to be his partner in that world. Sophia smiled sadly. That's very wise. And it's the kind of self-awareness you lacked 2 months ago. You've grown. They parted that day with a tentative peace between them. Isabella didn't ask about Marco, and Sophia didn't offer information. That chapter was closed. That something new had opened, a mutual respect and understanding. Perhaps even the beginning of a friendship built on honesty rather than pretense. Over the following year, Isabella continued her therapy and her growth. She went back to work, this time at a nonprofit that provided legal services to domestic violence survivors. The work was challenging and often heartbreaking. But it felt meaningful in a way her corporate job never had. Listening to women's stories about violence and trauma gave her a different perspective on her own moment of loss of control. It reinforced her commitment to never be on the perpetrator's side of that equation again. She also maintained a relationship with both Rosa and Sophia. They had lunch occasionally, 3 women from different backgrounds who had found unexpected connection through shared pain and growth. Rosa became a mentor figure, sharing wisdom earned through decades of service and observation. Sophia became something like a friend, offering perspective on life's challenges and the complicated work of becoming who you're meant to be. 18 months after the slap, Isabella was invited to speak at a conference on domestic violence prevention. She almost declined, feeling like an imposter. But her therapist encouraged her, saying her story about recognizing and changing her own capacity for violence was valuable. So Isabella stood before a room of advocates, survivors, and professionals and told her story. She talked about the slap, about the shame and self-discovery that followed, about the importance of understanding our triggers and developing emotional regulation. She talked about the grace of being forgiven and the work of forgiving herself. When she finished, there was a moment of silence before the room erupted in applause. Afterward, dozens of people approached her to share their own stories, to thank her for her honesty, to say they saw themselves in her journey. Among the crowd was a woman who introduced herself as Dr. Patricia Valdez, director of a center for restorative justice. I'd love to talk to you about potentially doing some work with us. We need people who can speak honestly about their own capacity for harm, and their journey toward change. That conversation led to Isabella becoming a regular speaker and workshop facilitator. She discovered she was good at helping others understand the roots of reactive violence, and the paths toward healing and change. The work was fulfilling in ways she had never anticipated. 2 years after the incident, Isabella ran into Marco at a fundraiser. They hadn't spoken since the day he had ordered her out of his house. She felt her heart rate spike when she saw him across the room, but she made herself approach him calmly. Marco, it's good to see you. He turned, and she saw surprise cross his face before it was replaced with polite neutrality. Isabella, you look well. They talked for a few minutes, careful and polite. He told her about changes in his business, his work to move toward more legitimate operations. She told him about her work with survivors and perpetrators of violence. And then, in a moment of quiet honesty, he said something that surprised her. My mother told me about the work you've been doing. About how you've changed. I'm glad for you, Isabella. true thank you, she said. And Marco, I'm sorry. For everything, you deserved better than what I showed you that day. We both had growing to do, he said thoughtfully. Maybe we both got what we needed. Even though it wasn't what we wanted at the time. They parted amicably. Two people who had loved each other once, and had both been changed by the painful way that love ended. 5 years after the slap heard round the world, as Rosa jokingly called it, Isabella stood in front of a group of young women at a high school assembly. She told her story again, watching their faces. Seeing some of them recognize themselves in her younger self. The point isn't that I hit someone once and then everything was fine because I felt bad about it. She told them. The point is that I had to face something ugly in myself. Something I didn't want to believe I was capable of. And then I had to do years of hard work to understand where that capacity came from and how to make sure it never expressed itself that way again. She paused, looking out at the sea of young faces. We all have the capacity for harm, every one of us. The question isn't whether we're capable of doing damage when we're hurt or angry or scared. The question is what we do when we discover that capacity. Do we deny it and risk repeating it? Or do we face it honestly and do the work to change? After the assembly, a young woman approached her, tears streaming down her face. I hit my boyfriend last week, she whispered. I didn't know what to do, I felt so ashamed. Isabella took her hands. The shame is appropriate. It means you know what you did was wrong. But shame alone doesn't create change. You need to understand why it happened, and get help to make sure it doesn't happen again. Would you like me to connect you with some resources? Helping that young woman, and dozens of others over the years, gave Isabella's mistake a kind of purpose. It didn't erase what she had done or make it okay. But it meant that her worst moment had become a catalyst for growth, both her own and others. The maid had begged her to stop. But Isabella hadn't listened. The Mafia boss's fiancé had slapped his mother in a moment of wounded pride and unchecked rage. And she had regretted it every single day since. But that regret had been transformed into self-awareness, into growth, into a commitment to help avoid the same mistakes, into wisdom earned through pain and honest reckoning. 10 years after that terrible afternoon, Isabella received an invitation to Sofia Romano's 70th birthday celebration. She attended with Rosa, the two of them arm in arm, their unlikely friendship now a decade strong. Sofia embraced them both warmly. And Isabella marveled at how far they had all come from that moment in the sitting room. As the party wound down, Sofia pulled Isabella aside. I want to tell you something. What happened 10 years ago, as painful as it was, taught me something important too. It taught me that I needed to be more gentle in how I delivered hard truths. That being right doesn't excuse being harsh. You weren't the only one who needed to learn and grow from that day. Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. We taught each other then. We did. Sofia agreed. And we've continued to teach each other since. That's what the best relationships do, they make us better, even when it's painful. The slap would always be part of Isabella's story. But it was no longer the defining moment. Instead, it was the beginning of a journey toward understanding herself, toward genuine strength. Toward becoming someone who could face difficult truths without becoming destructive. As if this story resonated with you. If it reminded you that our worst moments don't have to define us. If it gave you hope that real change is possible through honest work and grace from others. Please like this video and subscribe. Because we all need reminders that redemption isn't about erasing our mistakes. It's about facing them honestly, and letting them transform us into better versions of ourselves. Your worst moment isn't your final moment unless you choose to let it be. Choose growth. Choose change. Choose to become who you're meant to be. Thank you for watching.